Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our June 27th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode features two guests. First, Iowa State University soil science expert Dr. Michael Castellano shares details about an effort to optimize and localize Iowa's fertilizer application recommendations. Then, we'll bring on environmental scientist Shawn Richmond to share how optimal fertilizer applications complement farmers' other efforts to grow the crops we need while protecting our water quality. We'll start with Dr. Castellano, who met up with Spokesman editor Tom Block earlier this month. Since then, Governor Kim Reynolds has signed a bill that appropriates $1 million to update Iowa State's maximum return to nitrogen fertilizer recommendation tool, turning it into a dynamic, next-generation fertilizer modeling system. For more on that transition, we turn things over to Tom Block and to Dr. Michael Castellano.
Mike, thanks for joining us today. What is the maximum return to nitrogen calculator, and why does it need to be updated?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for your interest in this. So the maximum return to nitrogen calculator is the way we decide how much nitrogen to put on a corn crop in Iowa. What we know about nitrogen fertilizer for corn in Iowa is that the optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate to maximize productivity and profitability for the farmer varies enormously from field to field and year to year, all the way from 0 to more than 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre in many cases. So the way Iowa State University recommends farmers apply fertilizer is by conducting experiments on research farms where they apply a number of different fertilizer rates and they measure the response of corn to those fertilizer rates. And although the optimum fertilizer rate for corn production varies from 0 to more than 200 pounds an acre per year, the university recommends one value that's the average of those trials. And so they do those trials in four different ways. So they do recommend four different values for four systems in the state. Corn following corn in southeast Iowa and the rest of the state, those are two. And then corn following soybeans in southeast Iowa versus the rest of the state. About 5 years ago, they split off southeast Iowa from the rest of the state because corn there requires more nitrogen because it's a wetter part of the state. And that's the thinking behind those four rates. But what's implicit in those rates, and well known to scientists, is that the actual optimum rate from field to field and year to year, whether you're in southeast Iowa or northwest Iowa, varies by an enormous amount, more than 100 pounds per acre per year. So through this project, we're trying to recommend field and year specific fertilizer rates for farmers so they don't under-apply fertilizer in some cases and sacrifice yield, or over-apply fertilizer in some cases and not only lose profitability, but also harm the environment as well.
And let's dig into that a little bit, Mike. What are some of the enhancements that researchers are looking to make more specific field-by-field recommendations?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Tom. So as we talked about, the current nitrogen fertilizer recommendations present an average to the farmer for two very different parts of the state and two very different cropping systems. Yet we can make more targeted, better nitrogen fertilizer recommendations within those systems by considering genetics, management, and environment. And so some examples of that are environment, soil type. Some soil types require less nitrogen fertilizer than others within those areas, southeast Iowa and the rest of the state. Some weather years, dry and warm, require less nitrogen than wet and cold weather years. And we can take all this information into complex quantitative models and start to develop predictions that farmers can use to better manage fertilizer for productivity, profitability, and environmental performance.
Mike, this is something you've been studying under pilot projects. What would it take to get this project off the ground into a more robust standard?
Yeah, Tom. So for the past 2 years, we've been conducting pilot projects that have been strung together by small bits and pieces of funding from various partners in the state, the university, state agencies, and agricultural groups. But we really want to move beyond that with consistent funding from the state so we can scale up to literally hundreds of these nitrogen fertilizer rate experiments that I mentioned earlier in our discussion that are required to really measure the optimum rate. And a big difference we could make with consistent funding for this project is that we could move the experiments onto real production farms using the latest advances in precision ag technologies, where we can conduct an experiment that's just as scientifically robust as is done on a university farm and has been done for the past decades. But the advantage of moving it to the production farm is we can encounter all the various realities that a farmer has to deal with and all the variables that a farmer chooses from. All those genetics, environment, and managed variables that we just talked about. When we conduct hundreds of trials in a year, we can get all sorts of combinations of those, put those combinations into our predictive models that are just like weather forecasts. Instead, they forecast the optimum nitrogen rate for a farm. And we can run those models, simulate all those outcomes, and then allow farmers to look and choose among the variables that they use on their farm, their genetics, their soil management, for example, their crop residue management, and the weather year that they're expecting to really narrow down that optimum fertilizer rate.
How will the research help achieve the goals of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy and improve the environmental sustainability of farming?
Applying the optimum nitrogen rate for every field and every year would really benefit environmental quality and meet the goals of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, largely because we know when farmers underapply nitrogen, they sacrifice yield and we don't get as many bushels produced out of the state. And those bushels have got to be produced somewhere. On the other hand, when we apply too much nitrogen fertilizer, not only do we sacrifice profitability by applying nitrogen that doesn't create an economic return to the farmer, but we also sacrifice an environmental quality. So our improvements by managing for field-specific rates, instead of people applying the average, they'll apply the right rate. Now, that'll bring some people up. They'll apply more nitrogen. It'll bring some people down. They'll apply less nitrogen. But overall, that will result in a reduction of environmental nitrogen losses. Why? Because when people underapply nitrogen and then they move up to the right rate, they don't increase environmental losses because there's a sink for that nitrogen in the plant. The plant uses that extra nitrogen. On the other hand, when we bring people down from applying too much nitrogen to the optimum rate, that represents a reduction in nitrate loss because it was excessive nitrogen applied to the field.
And that's something we've seen in this environment of really high fertilizer prices, Mike, that farmers are very interested in getting that right amount, that they're not just applying to apply.
Yeah, Tom, I've never had more calls from farmers than I have this year on what the optimum nitrogen rate is to apply for their field, because they recognize the current recommendations are just an average, and there's a lot of room for improvement. And when prices are high on fertilizer, you really need to make those improvements. But even when prices aren't high, nobody wants to over-apply fertilizer because it represents an economic loss to the operation that also results in environmental losses. This project would help achieve those goals.
Are there any other tools beyond determining the best nitrogen rate that could evolve out of these studies?
Yeah, Tom, we hope to develop a few tools for all Iowa stakeholders to use. We're not targeting these tools just to farmers, although, of course, they're our primary interest because we want to motivate change with these tools. We want to avoid and reduce farmer risk of underapplying fertilizer, which, of course, is a big deal. And by reducing that risk, we can hopefully get more farmers applying the exact right rate for their field and year. And these three tools that we're going to develop out of this project, the first one will be a benchmarking tool. So all Iowans will be able to see the real outcomes of these on-farm nitrogen fertilizer rates that we've discussed. So every year, all Iowans will be able to see the results of hundreds of nitrogen fertilizer rate trials every year. We hope that by being able to observe the outcomes of these fertilizer rate trials and seeing how variable the optimum rate is with location, soil type, year, and genetics, that people begin to better appreciate the challenges that Iowa farmers face with selecting the optimum nitrogen rate in every field and every year. Second tool we aim to produce out of this effort is a forecasting tool. So this forecasting tool will take the weather forecast into account, the operation into account, the genetics, the management, put those together in a quantitative process predictive model, just like a weather forecast, and allow farmers to see what the uncertainty is and what the optimum rate that's currently recommended under those conditions is. Third tool that we're planning to develop through this project is a hindcasting tool. So farmers can look back at the end of the season and say, if I had done this, how would the outcomes have changed on my operation? Through those three tools, we hope to help farmers apply fertilizer rates that are more accurate, and we also hope to help the general public see the challenges that are associated with optimum nitrogen fertilizer management and what Iowa farmers are doing to make improvements in fertilizer management.
As you all know, there's a lot riding on farmers' ability to get the most out of their fertilizer. Thanks to Dr. Castellano for joining us on the podcast to discuss how ISU's fertilizer recommendations will become even more robust and useful for farmers around the state in the years to come. As important as fertilizer is, it can also be misunderstood, especially the relationship between Iowa's natural soil fertility, the fertilizer that farmers apply, weather conditions, and the challenge of protecting Iowa's water quality. For clarification, Farm Bureau's Zach Bader sat down with Shawn Richmond, an environmental scientist who serves as Iowa Farm Bureau's Conservation and Natural Resources Policy Advisor.
Shawn, we've had a rainy spring and summer so far, so naturally we're seeing some increased news coverage about nitrates in Iowa's water, especially the Des Moines and Raccoon rivers here in central Iowa. And of course, along with that, we're seeing theories about what causes those nutrients to appear in our water. And unfortunately, that also leads to some misleading conclusions, like the claim that nitrates in our water result directly from too much fertilizer being applied to Iowa's fields. So as an environmental scientist, what's your take on that?
Well, I think for starters, it's important to recognize that, we have some of the most fertile soils in the Corn Belt in the U.S. and Iowa. We're naturally blessed to have high productivity soils. Research and work at Iowa State University has shown that, on average, we have around 10,000 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the top 6 inches of our soil. So there's a lot of nitrogen, a lot of dynamics at play in our soils that can lead to some of these relatively small losses. When we look at farmers and managing their nutrient inputs, really it's a small fraction of that overall nitrogen pool. When we're applying maybe 1% to 2% on an annual basis, contributing to that overall 10,000 pounds per acre, that's a relatively small fraction. And that's really aimed at obviously crop productivity goals, but also to help maintain soil fertility. What we don't want to see is, dramatically under-applying or, under-fertilizing our corn production, because in those cases, if we were to do that, it could mine the soil organic matter, which could lead to bigger problems really environmentally with reducing the soil's capacity to hold water, cycle nutrients, and those types of things. So really, Iowa farmers are doing an excellent job with their fertility to manage the crop needs, to manage and maintain the productivity of our soils. And also, they're doing that in a really efficient manner. When we look at the trends and where we're at today with timing of application, with precision applications, farmers have really stepped up across the state to help better manage the timing in particular. We do not see nearly as much, single application in the fall or the spring. We're seeing much more split applications of nitrogen. again, to manage a lot of the dynamics in our system, like the weather. When we come off of drought years, certainly farmers are looking much more closely at the year ahead and thinking, what may line up in the spring? How do I best manage my nutrient applications, the timing to put the nutrients out there at the best time where they can be available for the crop and minimize the risk of leaching and runoff.
So what I hear you saying is that Iowa has a lot of nitrogen naturally in its soil. Farmers are applying relatively little. 1% to 2% of the nitrogen in our soil on those farms may be coming from the farmer, and they're doing it in such a precise and timed out way so as to make the most use of those nutrients.
Yeah, that's correct. And then when we look at the loss side of the equation, on average, I know according to Iowa State University and some of the work done for the nutrient strategy, we were seeing on average maybe 25 pounds per acre losses of nitrogen from our farm fields and those things across the state. Now, obviously, not all of that comes from the fertilizer application. There's a lot of mineralization, nutrient cycling, and as we have forms of nitrogen that can move with water, part of that can be attributed to the fertilizer that's applied. A large portion of that, though, is naturally available in the soil and things that are susceptible to leaching when we have significant rainfall events, for example. So, looking back, a couple good examples we've had in the recent past of situations that can set up that really are weather-driven is, the drought of 2012 into the spring of 13 when we had the wettest spring on record. When we have drought conditions, there may be the potential that we have some residual nitrate in our soils. And as we get some heavy rainfall events, that's susceptible to leaching through and coming out. Similar to just this past fall, we had, in drought conditions coming into this spring. Wasn't quite as bad as far as the spring rainfall totals, but again, that's something that farmers are aware of as much as anybody. Looking ahead, managing the best of their ability, the timing and the application and the rates to ensure that as small of losses as possible can be achieved, given all the other competing factors that they have to contend with.
What are some of the decision support tools that are available to help farmers make those fertilizer decisions, and is there anything on the horizon that we can expect that'll kind of improve those tools?
One of the long-standing tools that has been available in Iowa for farmers is to help, provide support in that decision process of their fertility is a tool that was developed by Iowa State University. It's the corn nitrogen rate calculator, and part of that, you can put in your input costs, what you expect to market your commodity for, and it will return kind of the economic optimum rate of fertility based off of those inputs. That's based off of, historically research plots at Iowa State University that conduct rate trials. Currently, the ability of that tool is somewhat limited as far as the localness it can provide some of those recommendations. What it does in Iowa currently is gives a number for the majority of the state for both the corn and soy rotation and the corn, and then also has a breakout for southeast Iowa. And really the limitations today on that relate back to just the number of data and input points they have put into that. So it's not a bad tool, I'm not saying that at all. Somewhat limited currently in its capacity to provide more local recommendations to farmers. But that said, there is an effort currently underway to really expand the rate trials across the state, to provide a lot more robustness in the recommendations, dramatically increase the number of rate trials. The goal of this initiative currently being done by Iowa State University and some cooperating partners is to, at some day, hopefully in the near future, have rate trials being done in all of Iowa's 99 counties. Dramatically increase the number of data points we can put into that tool, and then really increase the ability for that to be a more local recommendation. If you could envision, for example, something that might give you a more specific recommendation for a particular crop reporting district, something closer to home for farmers as compared to just something that gives you a number for the majority of the state. So there's a lot of work going into that, a lot of optimism about the improvements that'll help us bring about. It's going to be employing the latest technologies with precision ag platforms to help really carry out multiple replicated trials all over the state in a very efficient manner, also providing a considerable amount of additional information than we've been able to collect in the past.
So I think we hear about nitrates in the news, maybe most of us see it as a headline that we see from time to time if there's a nitrate spike that's been detected. But talk to us overall about what the trend has been with nitrates in the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers over the past few years.
Yeah, so if you look at USGS monitoring data is available for several of the rivers, including the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers in Iowa. Looking at the data there, going back 7 years, for example, from 2014 through 2021, there have been markedly lower levels of nitrate concentrations in both of those rivers. The Raccoon River is down on a trend line of 77% since 2014. The Des Moines River is about 83% lower on the trend line for nitrate concentrations. And that's not surprising to see, given a lot of the factors that have contributed to that. Certainly there's good efforts of farmers making sure they are managing their nutrient applications the best they can. A lot of that is weather impact as well. We have had relatively drier conditions over that period, and so as we have less rainfall, less precipitation, less nutrient potential for moving through the soils and coming out into our surface waters, that's the type of trend we'd expect to see given those situations.
Okay, so you talk about the long-term trends in the rivers. Of course, what we hear about is those occasional spikes. So what causes those nitrates to spike on occasion?
Some of the larger spikes we see really tie back into when conditions set up where we're susceptible to having nutrient loss. Situations like I mentioned already about, coming off of a drought condition into a wetter period of weather. Those are instances in particular when if we have free nitrate available in the soil, outside of when we have the growing crops and other management practices that can help to hold those in place. As the water precipitates through the soil profile, then we can see some large spikes, relatively speaking. So again, a lot of it does tie back to weather, but it's not to say that farmers aren't doing a whole host of things and practices to help mitigate that to the best extent possible. We've seen dramatic increase in the use of management practices such as cover crops that really help to hold those nutrients in place and sequester them for the next year's crop. Over 3 million acres in Iowa as of the recent survey results we have from the Iowa Nutrient Research and Education Council. Other things that they're doing, putting down nitrification inhibitors when they do apply that product in the fall to, again, reduce the availability of that to leach through the soils. Timing of application, putting it out there as close to the time when the crop can best utilize that as possible. We've seen all positive trends in all of these practices.
And I know I've heard you refer to before, when farmers are applying fertilizer, they're often doing it at a rate that is equal to or less than what we may be applying, you and I may be applying on our own lawns.
Yeah, if you look at, a traditional, fertilizer program that, folks would use for fertilizing their lawn over the course of the year, running the numbers on that, it actually comes out to a really close to the same rate of application that we would apply to our cornfields in the state. So, as you're out there doing that broadcast fertilizer on your lawn, and it seems like a relatively tiny amount as those are just being spread out across the grass. Think about that's the same approximate rate that farmers are utilizing on their corn acres. So again, it's tied back into the fertility needs and economically as well. We've seen some really dramatic increases in fertilizer input prices over the past year, upwards of 300% increase. That increasingly calls the need to as efficiently managing fertilizer inputs as possible. Farmers certainly recognize that better than anybody, that, although we've seen some great, trends in commodity prices and market values, the input prices going up as dramatically as they have still keep the focus on efficiently managing that. So the margins are getting pretty tight between, the commodity prices and input prices still at the high values the commodity prices are currently at. This really comes back to as much of an economic decision, really not wanting to lose anything to the environment, wanting to keep as much of those nutrients available for the crops as possible.
I think another interesting aside to that, of course, is, if farmers are applying at roughly the same rate as consumers, they're doing that grow our food, right? To grow our fuel as well. So I think that's obviously, even that much more impressive in that light as well. So let's talk a little bit more. You've mentioned cover crops. You've mentioned how farmers are really splitting up those applications exactly to time that when those crops need it, spoon feed that at a rate that the crops need to be efficient for the environment as well as for their own economics. Talk a little bit about some more of these conservation practices, wetlands, bioreactors. There's a whole host of practices that are out there that farmers are using to apply directly to this nitrogen issue. There are factors, as we have discussed, that are outside of their control, but they are yet taking on the challenge of addressing this nitrate issue.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of great practices, and the science that's outlined in the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. Again, those kind of break out into a few categories of the ways that we can help address this. Certainly the infield management, we've talked about that already with, managing your source, timing, rate, placement of nutrients to be as efficient as possible and minimize potential for loss. There's a lot of other great practices as well, really the ones that are kind of the edge of field type of things like wetlands and bioreactors and saturated buffers, and which are all relatively new practices that the science has helped us to identify. They have big impacts on reducing our nitrate. Wetlands, bioreactors, saturated buffers, all will help reduce nitrate by 50% or more. So again, as we do the best we can in field, utilizing the nutrients in the field as efficiently as possible, these other practices give us another way to look at reducing the nutrients that do leach through those fields before they go on down into downstream waters. So it's a great comprehensive approach to both be looking at in-field management and the edge of field management combined to do the best job possible with the best available technologies to reduce those losses in farm fields.
Some people will probably ask, is this progress happening fast enough? Or they might see a headline about a seasonal spike in nitrates and wonder if progress is happening at all. So what would you say to that progress and the speed of progress concern, comment, question?
For starters, don't lose sight of the scope of what we're working to address here. We can't expect to see things change overnight. With the scale of production we have in the state, we've seen great progress in the past, particularly on our efforts focused on reducing soil erosion, which also helps to address reducing our phosphorus losses because the majority of that phosphorus is attached to sediment. We've seen great adoption of reduced tillage, for example, is one great example. As of recently, conventional full tillage is no longer the convention in Iowa and for large portions of the U.S. In Iowa, actually, conservation tillage and no-till account for 74% of the tillage done in the state. So we've made some really great progress there. And then in addition to several of the other practices that we've implemented, like terraces and waterways and ponds that help to really, hold that phosphorus in place or prevent erosion. Combining those all together with the work that's been done over the past several decades, we've actually achieved a 27% reduction in our phosphorus losses since the 80s. Our goal under the nutrient strategy for agriculture is to get to a 29% reduction in our phosphorus losses. So we're right there. We're very close. That goal is within reach. And these are the types of efforts that aren't going to stop anytime soon. We're going to continue to see those increase and see those numbers grow. I'm sure that, we'll get to that goal and then continue to surpass it. We're not going to get there and stop and say we made it. That's going to be efforts that really are tied again at keeping productive lands in place, and the resulting impact of that is helping to reduce our phosphorus losses. So those are the types of things that really are going to be ongoing efforts. We've made a lot of great strides to date towards those goals. And as you look back under those approaches that were employed is because that's where we put a lot of our focus. With the agency focus, with farmer focus, ever since the Dust Bowl era, a lot of our focus was really on that erosion issue. Nowadays, we're certainly pivoting more to look more heavily at how do we effectively reduce our nitrate and our nitrogen losses. And so, relatively speaking, that's a newer focus. but we do have a great example of the progress we've made with phosphorus, where we've dedicated our information and resources, dedicated our efforts. We have made positive progress. So as we look forward to addressing nitrogen, employing those same types of focus and dedication of resources, technical and financial and other, I wouldn't expect that we're going to see any different results in terms of seeing positive progress on reducing our nitrate. It will take time, though, as you mentioned. There's certainly a lot of dynamics at play with nitrate that impact our ability to really quickly get on top of that. It is going to take a longer-term effort and a lot of focus like we had in the past.
And while it will take time to get us where we want to go, there's clearly a sprint, a blitz, if you will, to kind of implement some of these newer practices. I know that I hear all the time about the number of wetlands that are in construction, the number of bioreactors and saturated buffers, technology that we didn't even have prior to the nutrient reduction strategy just a decade ago, and scaling up those practices as well. So while it will take time, there's clearly a concerted effort and a press on getting these practices where they need to be out in Iowa's landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Recent efforts, particularly with some of the blitz projects that are looking at ways to really dramatically increase the pace and scale of implementation of several practices that help us address nitrogen. It's the type of things, I hadn't seen, earlier in my career when I was at Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, working on wetlands to help reduce nitrogen losses. Some of those things certainly weren't going as fast as we would have liked to have seen back then, but thanks to great increase in the number of partnerships, helping to add that capacity, largely out across the landscape, we're seeing a really dramatic increase in those practices, finding new ways to more efficiently utilize resources and get a lot more work done in a lot faster manner.
With the right tools, Iowa's farmers have proven that they're up to the task of taking on any challenge. We're seeing that right now as farmers scale up their use of cover crops, saturated buffers, bioreactors, and other innovative practices to prevent nitrate loss. And farmers will be eager to see the next generation tailored fertilizer recommendations that Iowa State's working on as well. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for our next one on July 11th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.